June 1942. The southern edge of Sevastopol. Dawn arrives without warmth. The limestone hills are still, broken only by wind brushing over shattered scrub and the distant rumble of artillery somewhere beyond the horizon. In a shallow depression overlooking a German advance route, a young Soviet sniper lies motionless, her body pressed into the earth as if trying to disappear into it. The rifle beneath her cheek is cold. The scope is already fogged once, then cleared with the edge of a glove. She does not move again. Hours pass like this. No firing, no sound. Only waiting. Below her position, German infantry move cautiously, aware that something unseen has already claimed too many men along this ridge. Helmets appear, then vanish. Shadows stretch and contract with the rising sun. Somewhere in that slow, deliberate movement is a mistake waiting to happen. She is not thinking about numbers, not about records, not about survival beyond the next breath. Her attention narrows to geometry angles, distances, the way a body leans when it believes it is safe. When the rifle finally fires, it is a single, precise interruption of silence. Nothing dramatic follows. No shout, no charge. Just the quiet removal of one more life from the battlefield, and the continuation of a war that has learned to fear a lone figure it cannot see. This moment did not come from legend. It came from a world collapsing into total war. By the summer of 1941, Europe was no longer a continent at war. It was a continent being dismantled piece by piece by industrial violence. Poland had fallen. France had collapsed with a speed that stunned even its conquerors. The British Empire fought on alone in the West, while in the East, an uneasy silence stretched across thousands of kilometers of border between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. That silence ended on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa was not merely an invasion. It was the largest land assault in human history. Nearly 4 million German and Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory in 3 massive army groups, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. The objective was annihilation, not occupation, not negotiation. The Soviet state, its army, and its people were to be destroyed and replaced. In the opening weeks, the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Entire formations were encircled and erased. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers disappeared into prisoner columns or mass graves. Soviet airfields burned on the ground. Command structures collapsed under the speed of the German advance, and the myth of invincibility cultivated by the Wehrmacht seemed, for a time, to be real. But the German advance carried a hidden flaw. Speed demanded exposure. Tanks outran infantry. Supply lines stretched thin across hostile territory, and everywhere the Germans moved, they encountered not a defeated people, but a mobilizing one. By late summer 1941, the Eastern Front had become a war of attrition on a scale unseen before. Cities turned into fortresses. Forests and villages became killing grounds. The Soviet Union, absorbing losses that would have ended most states, began adapting its methods of survival. Quantity alone was no longer enough. Precision became necessity. Snipers were not new to warfare, but the Eastern Front transformed them into strategic weapons. Vast open spaces, ruined urban environments, and prolonged static engagements created ideal conditions for men and women trained to kill patiently. One rifle, properly used, could halt an advance, break a unit's morale, and force an enemy to waste time and resources hunting a ghost. The Red Army understood this quickly, partly through doctrine, partly through desperation. Marksmen were pulled from infantry units and retrained. Sniper schools expanded. Field manuals were rewritten to emphasize concealment, endurance, and psychological pressure rather than sheer firepower. German soldiers noticed the change before German commanders fully understood it. Officers began disappearing during routine inspections. Machine gun crews refused to expose themselves. Entire platoons froze under the suspicion that any movement might draw a fatal shot. The battlefield was no longer just violent, it was watched. Nowhere did this transformation become more pronounced than in the south. Along the Black Sea coast, in cities like Odessa and Sevastopol, the war slowed into brutal, grinding sieges. These were not campaigns decided by sweeping maneuvers. They were contests of nerves, observation, and patience. It was into this environment already saturated with fear and improvisation that a new generation of Soviet snipers stepped forward. Some were peasants, some were hunters, some were students whose lives had been interrupted and repurposed by invasion. Among them was a young woman whose name would later be repeated in newspapers, speeches, and enemy reports alike, not because she fit a myth, but because the war had given her no alternative role. And to understand how she arrived at the front line with a rifle in her hands, it is necessary to step backward away from the battlefield and into the Soviet Union that existed just before everything began to burn. Before the rifle, there was a classroom. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was born in July 1916 at the edge of an empire already unraveling. By the time she reached adolescence, the Russian Civil War had ended, the Soviet Union had formed, and the state had begun reshaping not only its borders but its people. Discipline, physical readiness, and loyalty were no longer personal virtues. They were national requirements. Her family moved to Kyiv when she was a teenager. It was there, in a city balancing industry, education, and ideology, that Pavlichenko encountered marksmanship not as a weapon but as a skill. Shooting clubs were common across the Soviet Union in the 1930s, organized under mass programs like OSO Aviakim paramilitary training societies. Designed to prepare civilians for the next war everyone assumed was coming. Marksmanship was encouraged. So was competition. Pavlichenko joined a local shooting range not to make a statement, but to keep up. Accounts from the period describe her as determined, precise, and intensely focused traits rewarded in Soviet sport culture long before they were needed in combat. By 1937, she was studying history at Kyiv University. Her academic path suggested a future in archives and lecture halls, not trenches. But even in civilian life, military preparation remained constant. Students trained with rifles. Civil defense drills were routine. War, in the Soviet imagination, was not a possibility, it was an eventuality. When Germany invaded in June 1941, Pavlichenko did not hesitate. Like thousands of others, she volunteered for service immediately. What followed was not an automatic acceptance. Women were present in the Red Army, but frontline combat roles were still contested spaces. Many female volunteers were diverted into nursing, communications, or logistics. Pavlichenko refused reassignment. Her prior training mattered. So did timing. The Red Army could not afford to discard proven shooters when entire divisions were being destroyed faster than replacements could be trained. She was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division, part of the forces defending Odessa, and issued a Mosin-Nagant rifle with a telescopic sight. There was no ceremony, no transformation montage. Her first days at the front were marked by confusion, exhaustion, and observation. Veteran soldiers tested her. Some doubted openly. Others waited silently to see whether she would break under fire. She did not. The Soviet sniper doctrine emphasized patience over aggression. Snipers were trained to move little, fire rarely, and survive above all else. Kills were counted not as trophies, but as evidence of battlefield impact. Each shot required verification by officers, spotters, or recovered enemy positions. Exaggeration was discouraged, not for moral reasons, but because false data distorted tactical planning. Pavlichenko adapted quickly. She learned terrain the way others learned faces. She memorized routes, habits, and pauses. German soldiers, disciplined and methodical, often repeated movements at the same time each day. What looked like order from within became predictability when watched long enough. By late 1941, Odessa fell. The Soviet forces withdrew by sea to Sevastopol, carrying with them not only survivors, but experience. The siege that followed would last months. It would consume entire units, and it would turn snipers from specialists into symbols feared, hunted, and prioritized targets. For Pavlichenko, Sevastopol was not where she became famous. It was where repetition hardened into method and method into efficiency. By the time German command began circulating reports about a particularly effective Soviet sniper operating in the area, she had already learned the most important rule of survival on the Eastern Front: do not be seen. Do not rush, and never assume the enemy is careless, only human. Those lessons would soon be tested from every possible angle. Angle 1. The human angle. Endurance, isolation, and fear. Sniping on the Eastern Front was not defined by moments of firing. It was defined by everything in between. For hours, sometimes entire days, a sniper remained motionless. Muscles cramped. Insects crawled beneath clothing. Hunger sharpened concentration and dulled judgment at the same time. In winter, cold seeped through boots and bone alike. In summer, the heat turned breath into a liability. Any movement could mean death. Pavlichenko endured this not because she was immune to fear, but because fear was constant. German counter-snipers actively hunted successful Soviet shooters. Once a sniper was identified, artillery followed. Mortars followed. Entire sectors were flattened to remove a single unseen threat. Isolation was absolute. A sniper operated alone or with a spotter, often beyond friendly lines. If wounded, rescue was uncertain. If captured, survival was unlikely. Pavlichenko later described fear not as panic, but as something quieter, something that forced attention inward and sharpened every decision. This psychological pressure wore down even experienced soldiers. Many broke, some froze, others fired too quickly just to end the waiting. Pavlichenko did not rush. Her discipline became her protection, and that discipline made her dangerous. Angle 2. The tactical angle. Patience as a weapon. Pavlichenko's effectiveness did not come from volume of fire. It came from geometry. She selected firing positions not for visibility but for inevitability, routes where infantry had no alternative, supply paths that appeared safe because they had been safe yesterday, rubble piles that forced men to pause before climbing. She studied patterns. German units were trained, efficient, and systematic qualities that worked against them under observation. Helmets rose at the same parapets. Officers leaned forward during inspections. Machine gun crews adjusted tripods with ritual precision. Pavlichenko waited for those moments. The so-called trick later attributed to her was not deception in the theatrical sense. It was restraint. She did not fire at the first available target. She waited for the one whose removal would force others to expose themselves. A single shot, properly timed, could draw medics, officers, or curious soldiers into view. This was not cruelty. It was doctrine sharpened by necessity. By reducing movement after firing, relocating slowly, and never shooting twice from the same position, she avoided detection long enough to repeat the process day after day. Each success reinforced German caution. Each hesitation slowed their advance. The rifle was only part of the system. Time was the real weapon. Angle 3. The psychological angle. Fear as terrain. German soldiers on the Eastern Front spoke of snipers as if they were environmental hazards like mines or artillery, except invisible. The knowledge that someone was watching changed behavior immediately. Men stopped moving in daylight. Officers avoided open inspections. Entire units hugged cover longer than doctrine allowed. Progress slowed not because of resistance, but because of anticipation. Pavlichenko's presence amplified this effect. Reports circulated of a sniper who never missed. Whether accurate or not, the belief mattered more than the reality. The battlefield bent around the idea of her existence. Snipers do not need to kill many to change a battle. They need to be believed. And belief, once established, is difficult to dislodge. By early 1942, German command recognized the threat and began deploying experienced counter-snipers into Sevastopol. These were not ordinary infantrymen. They were specialists, trained to detect patience with patience. What followed was no longer simply hunting. It was a duel conducted in silence. Angle 4. The technological angle. Limits of the rifle. The weapon in Pavlichenko's hands was not exceptional. The Mosin-Nagant 1891/30 was a rugged, mass-produced bolt-action rifle. Its Pu telescopic sight offered limited magnification by modern standards and was prone to fogging, misalignment, and damage under prolonged use. It lacked refinement. It lacked comfort. It lacked forgiveness. But it functioned. In the conditions of the Eastern Front, mud, dust, snow, and neglect reliability mattered more than elegance. The Mosin-Nagant fired a powerful cartridge capable of penetrating cover and maintaining accuracy over long distances. Its recoil demanded discipline. Its slow rate of fire punished impatience. For a sniper, these limitations reinforced method. Every shot had to count. Reloading took time. Reacquiring a target took longer. Pavlichenko adapted her breathing, her posture, and her timing to the rifle's rhythm rather than fighting it. Technology did not make her lethal. Familiarity did. Angle 5, the leadership angle. Doctrine under pressure. The Soviet High Command did not romanticize snipers. It institutionalized them. By late 1941, sniper units were formalized across multiple fronts. Kill confirmations were recorded. Techniques were shared. Experienced shooters were ordered to train others, sometimes pulling them from the front, not as punishment, but as preservation of knowledge. Pavlichenko trained dozens of snipers during pauses in combat. This was not publicized at the time. It was practical. A single effective sniper could multiply impact by teaching others to replicate methods under different terrain and conditions. Commanders valued her not only for her confirmed kills, but for her consistency. She did not inflate numbers. She did not break discipline. She survived. That survival mattered. Dead snipers taught nothing. Angle 6, the enemy angle. German countermeasures. German forces were not unprepared for snipers. They had their own doctrine, their own marksmen, and their own hunting teams. But Barbarossa's pace left little room for adaptation early on. By 1942, that changed. German counter-snipers began operating specifically to neutralize Soviet sharpshooters. Artillery was used not to destroy positions, but to deny terrain. Snipers worked in pairs or teams, baiting shots and tracing trajectories. Pavlichenko faced these specialists directly. Records indicate multiple confirmed counter-sniper kills attributed to her during the Sevastopol siege. These encounters were not dramatic. They were prolonged standoffs where the first mistake was the last. Victory in such duels did not come from faster reflexes. It came from refusing to be drawn into impatience. Each duel removed not just a soldier, but a threat specifically trained to end her life. By the spring of 1942, the cumulative effect of these engagements reached a breaking point. German pressure intensified. Soviet positions shrank. The siege tightened. The war in Sevastopol was approaching a moment where survival and endurance would no longer be enough. Something was about to give. By May 1942, Sevastopol was no longer a city in the conventional sense. It was a wound that refused to close. German artillery dominated the heights. Luftwaffe bombers struck daily, methodically pulverizing fortifications carved into limestone and earth. The Soviet defenders lived underground when they could, emerging only to fight, observe, and die. Ammunition ran low. Food ran lower. The siege had stripped the front of any illusion of movement. What remained was pressure constant, compressing, and final. For snipers, this environment was both ideal and fatal. Visibility was reduced by smoke and dust. Landmarks vanished under repeated bombardment. Positions that had once been safe for weeks became death traps in minutes once identified. German command, aware of Pavlichenko and others like her, placed increasing emphasis on counter-sniper operations. This was no longer incidental combat. It was targeted removal. Pavlichenko continued operating despite the narrowing space. Her confirmed kill count rose steadily, documented through reports and witness verification. By this stage, she had surpassed 200. The numbers mattered operationally, but they were not her focus. What mattered was rhythm-finding moments when the enemy believed the danger had passed. German units adapted by changing routines. Officers stopped exposing themselves. Helmets were passed above parapets on sticks. Dummy movements tested reactions. These measures slowed Soviet fire, but they also slowed German advance. Fear had become reciprocal. Several recorded sniper duels during this period involved hours, sometimes days of waiting without movement. One mistake meant instant death. Pavlichenko later recalled that these engagements were the most exhausting, not physically, but mentally. The enemy was no longer careless. He was trained, alert, and patient. It was here that her method, misunderstood later as a crazy trick, proved decisive. She did not seek engagement. She allowed it to come to her. She learned to recognize unnatural stillness, shadows that held too long, terrain that felt watched. When she fired, it was because certainty had replaced suspicion. One German counter-sniper was confirmed after an exchange lasting several hours, another after nearly a full day. These were not victories celebrated in the moment. They were simply endings. By early June, Pavlichenko's confirmed kills reached 309. This figure was not announced publicly at the time. It existed in reports, in ledgers, in quiet acknowledgement among command staff who understood what such consistency meant under siege conditions. Then, on June 10, 1942, the war reached her directly. During an artillery bombardment, Pavlichenko was wounded by mortar fire. The injury was not immediately fatal, but it was decisive. She was evacuated from the front, not as a retreat, but as a necessity. The Red Army could no longer justify risking one of its most effective snipers in a collapsing defense. Her removal from Sevastopol did not stop the siege. Within weeks, the city would fall, but her absence marked a turning point, not only in her war, but in how she would be used by the state that had trained her to disappear. The rifle was set down. Another role was waiting. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko was pulled from Sevastopol, the decision was clinical, not sentimental. The wound itself was survivable. Many soldiers returned to the line with worse. But Pavlichenko was no longer just a combatant. By mid-1942, she represented accumulated experience the Red Army could not afford to lose. Snipers could be trained. Veterans could not be replaced. As Sevastopol collapsed under the weight of sustained bombardment, she was moved east, away from the encirclement. The transition was abrupt, one day defined by dust, silence, and observation, the next by hospitals, reports, and interviews. The war did not end for her, it changed shape. Official tallies finalized her combat record: 309 confirmed kills in approximately 11 months of frontline duty, including dozens of enemy snipers. These figures were not inflated from morale posters. They were logged, cross-checked, and preserved because sniper effectiveness depended on accuracy, not myth. Yet myth followed anyway. The Soviet state, bleeding on every front, recognized symbolic power when it appeared. Pavlichenko was young, articulate, and undeniably real. She was not presented as a curiosity. She was presented as evidence that the Red Army adapted, endured, and learned faster than its enemy expected. In late 1942, she was sent abroad as part of a Soviet delegation to the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. The purpose was strategic, to solidify Allied support and emphasize the scale of the Eastern Front. Pavlichenko's presence carried weight precisely because she did not fit expectation. She spoke plainly. She avoided dramatization. When questioned about her appearance rather than her experience, she responded with irritation rather than charm. Her now famous remarks were not scripted lines. They were expressions of exhaustion from someone who had spent nearly a year watching people die through a scope. The transformation was complete. The sniper who had survived by remaining unseen was now required to be visible. But this visibility came with a cost. She would never return to frontline combat. The skills that had kept her alive, patience, silence, detachment, were no longer useful in auditoriums and press rooms. Her war, defined by restraint, ended not with a final shot, but with removal. Sevastopol fell in July 1942. The Eastern Front continued grinding westward for nearly 3 more years. New snipers replaced the old, new numbers replaced the old ones. But Pavlichenko's battlefield had already concluded. What followed was not peace, but consequence, because wars do not stop shaping people when the fighting ends. They simply change the way the damage appears. The war did not slow after Sevastopol, it accelerated. By late 1942 and early 1943, the Eastern Front entered its most destructive phase. Stalingrad consumed entire armies. Kursk redefined mechanized warfare. Millions more would die before the Reich collapsed. In that expanding violence, Pavlichenko no longer fired a weapon, but her influence continued moving outward. The Soviet sniper program, refined through siege and attrition, became institutionalized. Training manuals incorporated lessons learned from Sevastopol, extended concealment, controlled firing discipline, psychological disruption, and decentralized initiative. Snipers were no longer attached loosely to infantry units. They were planned assets. Pavlichenko contributed directly to the shift. Removed from the front, she trained new snipers, reviewed field reports, and advised on doctrine. Her experience was not treated as legend, but as data. What worked? What failed? What got people killed? Her confirmed record, 309 enemy soldiers, became a benchmark rather than a slogan. It demonstrated what was possible under extreme conditions, but it also illustrated limits. 11 months of sustained sniper combat was near the threshold of human endurance. Very few who attempted to replicate it survived as long. Abroad, her impact was different. In the United States and Canada, she encountered a public largely insulated from the realities of land warfare. Audiences expected heroism. She offered attrition. When asked about fear, she spoke about duty. When asked about gender, she redirected attention to invasion, loss, and responsibility. Her presence reframed the war for some listeners, not as a distant conflict, but as a lived catastrophe unfolding in real time. Allied newspapers reported her words selectively, but the effect was measurable. She was proof that the Eastern Front was not abstraction. It was personal, relentless, and central to the war's outcome. British and American leaders recognized the value of that message. Meetings were arranged. Speeches continued. Yet behind the diplomacy, the reality remained unchanged. Pavlichenko would never return to the role that defined her. The rifle stayed behind. And while the Soviet Union celebrated victory in 1945, the internal reckoning, what the war had taken from those who survived, was already beginning. The damage did not announce itself loudly. It settled quietly, over years, and that silence would shape everything that came next. When the war ended, Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not step into triumph. She stepped into absence. The Soviet Union emerged victorious but hollowed. Cities were rebuilt. Medals were awarded. Parades marched through streets, still carrying the weight of uncounted graves. For many veterans, survival itself became an unspoken burden, one that could not be resolved by celebration or recognition. Pavlichenko returned to academia. She completed her studies. She worked as a historian and later as a researcher. On paper, it was a return to the life she had been building before 1941. In reality, the separation was permanent. The war had interrupted her education, but it had rewritten her internal landscape. She rarely spoke publicly about killing after the immediate post-war years. When she did, her tone remained factual, stripped of drama. Numbers were mentioned only when required. Emotion was kept at distance. This restraint was often misinterpreted as coldness. In truth, it was control, the same control that had kept her alive in Sevastopol. The popular image of her hardened over time. Later retellings reduced complexity into spectacle. The idea of a crazy trick or supernatural lethality obscured what had actually mattered: discipline, repetition, and psychological endurance under extreme conditions. The myth simplified what history had proven to be deeply human. Within military circles, her legacy was clearer. Soviet and later Russian sniper doctrine continued to reference early war experiences without naming individuals directly. The lessons were structural, not personal. Avoid predictability. Respect fatigue. Understand that the mind breaks before the body. Pavlichenko lived until 1974. She did not seek celebrity. She did not write memoirs filled with flourish. Her life after the war was quieter than her 11 months at the front, but no less shaped by them. The final consequence of her service was not fame or fear. It was silence. A silence shared by millions who survived a war that demanded everything and returned very little. And in that silence, the meaning of her actions becomes clearer, not as legend, but as evidence of what total war can extract from a single human life. History often seeks heroes, but the story of Lyudmila Pavlichenko reminds us that survival, method, and endurance are just as remarkable as legend. Her 309 confirmed kills were not the product of ingenuity or theatrics. They were the result of discipline honed under unimaginable pressure, of careful observation, of patience stretched across months of relentless combat. In the broader sweep of World War II, she illustrates the human dimension of industrialized slaughter. One rifle, held steady by one person, could shape fear, slow an advance, and teach armies to respect caution. Her skill was amplified not by imagination, but by the harsh arithmetic of war. Time, distance, terrain, and human psychology converged in a deadly equation she learned to navigate with precision. Her story also reframes how we think about women in combat. Pavlichenko was not a novelty. She was a soldier. She faced the same dangers, endured the same exhaustion, and adapted in ways that directly impacted strategy and survival. The narratives that exaggerate tricks or superhuman ability obscure a deeper truth. The war demanded extraordinary human adaptation, regardless of gender. Finally, her life beyond the battlefield is a meditation on the quiet cost of war. Surviving does not undo trauma. Recognition does not erase memory. Yet her experience left a mark on military practice, on international perception, and on the understanding of what it means to engage in combat with precision and restraint. The Eastern Front was a crucible. In it, Pavlichenko became both participant and observer, executor and teacher, survivor and symbol. Her story is not a myth. It is a measure of endurance, a reflection on humanity's capacity to persist amid chaos, and a reminder that even in war, the careful, patient, and unseen often matter most. Her rifle may have been put down, but the lessons she embodied continue to echo silently, persistently through history.